Green Day playing a gig. Now, Green Day began as a punk band. So what about the word punk? How did that ever come to describe a certain type of rebellious, high-energy rock and roll? Well, the answer is actually pretty complicated. The first use of the word punk seems to have arisen around the time Shakespeare was writing his very first play, sometime around 1590. It wasn't very flattering to be called a punk back then. That meant you were a certain type of male prostitute hired by older men. Those who spoke Gaelic back then used the word spong, which was their word for tinder, which sort of agrees with what was happening across the Atlantic in the American colonies. That's where a punk was a type of stick used to light a fire or light a fuse or maybe set up some fireworks. The colonists seem to have appropriated that word from the Algonquin Indians of Delaware. Their word was ponk, P-O-N-K, which is what they called ashes, powder, and dust. By the time we got to the era of Queen Victoria, punk either described a sort of Chinese incense, again, something that burned and left ashes, but it could also be used as a way of calling someone worthless or of poor quality. By the early 20th century, a punk could be a lot of things. The prostitute label was back in some quarters, especially for gay men, or it could mean a young criminal. Or if you worked in show business or the circus in the 1920s, punk was a young, inexperienced performer. From there, we jumped to 1953 in a movie called The Wild One starring Marlon Brando. He played a leather-jacketed motorcycle-riding young hoodlum named Johnny Strombo. And this was the first real movie to explore the whole phenomenon of the motorcycle gang in America. And it scared people. This movie, and all the attention it got, resurrected the notion of a punk as a young criminal, the old Victorian definition. As the 50s progressed, any young hoodlum, especially those wearing leather jackets, was soon referred to as a punk. Now, this coincided with the rise of rock and roll, a thing that many older people found most distressing. Some even referred to rock fans as punks because, they were troublemakers. By the time we got into the 1960s, a number of ragged and raw bands started to emerge from garages all over the continent. They sounded rough and they looked tough. The Seeds, the Trogs, the Kingsmen, the Barbarians, the Standells, the Count Five. Some of them even wore leather jackets, just like Marlon Brando did in The Wild One. The first writer to use the word punk to describe this sort of music was Lester Bangs. In a review of a Detroit band called the MC5, published in Rolling Stone on April 6, 1969, Bangs used the phrase, "a bunch of 16-year-old punks on a meth power trip." Usage began to spread. Then in May of 1971, another Rolling Stone writer named Dave Marsh wrote a long article on the reformation of a 60s garage band called Question Mark and the Mysterians. He described this reunion as a landmark explosion of punk rock. But the term punk rock still lacked focus. It was thrown around rather carelessly by writers and critics. Kiss was called a punk rock band. Alice Cooper was a punk. What brought it all home was a fanzine published by a New Yorker by the name of Legs McNeil. He was a fan of the scuzzy underground stuff happening on the bad side of town, and his favorite artists were the Velvet Underground and Lou Reed and Patti Smith and the New York Dolls and Iggy Pop. His fanzine was called Teenage News, after the title of an unreleased song by the New York Dolls. But then he bought an album by the Dictators, another local band from the scuzzy side of town. The album was called The Dictators Go Girl Crazy. Inside was a photograph of all four members of the band at a hamburger stand, and they were all wearing leather jackets. Hey, they look like a bunch of punks, Legs thought, and that became the new name of his fanzine, Punk. Legs wrote about all his favorite bands and all kinds of new groups that were sprouting up. As a new scene solidified around clubs like CBGB and Max's Kansas City and the Mud Club, he sold more of his zines. And soon, anyone featured in Punk magazine was referred to as a punk band. And then came along the Ramones to cement the deal. They dressed in leather motorcycle jackets and torn jeans, just like Johnny Strombo in The Wild One, and they played raw, ragged rock. They looked like punks, they behaved like punks, and they were featured in Punk magazine. And when the Ramones took off and when they imported their sound, attitude, and look to the UK, everybody started calling what they did punk rock, and it stuck. It's a long story, but that's how it happened.